All right, good evening. Thank you, everybody, for coming here. It looks like everybody from Louisiana's on this side and Mississippi's over here. That's all right. No, it's all good. Hey, we appreciate everybody coming. I know Friday night is a kind of a weird night for people getting off work and trying to get here, but we appreciate everybody who's here this evening. If you didn't notice on the back table, we do have her books for sale today. They won't be for sale tomorrow. You can always pick them up on Amazon. But they are cheaper here, buying them straight from the author. So, and I think you said you'll sign them. They're already signed. Yeah, she'll write a name if anybody wants that. So, I don't know. Some of you aren't real familiar with some of the scholarship or the scholarly areas of biblical studies, but sometimes people aren't very accessible. I tell people a lot of times it takes like 75 years to get something from the scholarly world down to the pulpit or down to the lay people. What's really neat, and it's not even really part of social media, I mean, that has something to do with it, but there's just a move of a lot of really humble, really awesome biblical scholars who are intentionally reaching out to people that are not in the scholarly world to share what God has shown them. And Dr. Imes is one of those. I was sharing earlier, I don't even think she remembered until I jogged her memory. I met her back in 2019 at a conference in Dallas, and I asked her this really obscure, really long question in the question and answer section of the conference. And she didn't really have the answer right off the bat. And she said, well, I don't really have that. And I didn't expect her to come back to it. A lot of people, they'll just, well, I'm not sure. I'll check on that. I'll get back to you. I'll email you. And about 30 minutes later in the conference, she said, hey, can I get the mic back? I found the answer. She was digging through the Bible, digging through her book, and she gave the answer. And so I thought that was really cool, really humble. And then even the fact that she's here, because I reached out to her last summer, and she said, look, my summer's busy, but we'll shoot for next year. And I didn't even reach out back to her. She reached out to me and said, hey, I really want to come encourage your congregation. And so that's why she's here. I just really love when people, not everybody's like that. Everybody's busy, and so that's not a slight on people that don't do it. But she's part of a group of, not even a unified, intentional group, but a part of a group of scholars who are intentional about bringing what God has shared with them to as many people as possible. So I think that's part of her passion. I'll let her give you her real introduction. But Dr. Carmen Imes.
Well, I am so encouraged to see you all here, and some of you drove a long way to be here, so I'm honored. It's just an honor to travel around and meet new people, see new faces, and get to talk about the Bible together, which is the best thing ever. So, as Matt said, I met him at the Naked Bible Conference 2019, which was just before my book came out, Bearing God's Name. Here is the cover of that on the right. And it really was that conference that kind of catalyzed for me the opportunity to take scholarship and make it accessible and available, connect with people in churches all over the world who want this content. Michael Heiser, it was Michael Heiser's conference where we met, and Michael Heiser is somebody who has all the academic credentials, but didn't ever get a job in the academy where he was just talking to other scholars. He made it his life's work to talk to everybody. And so I think I really see him as a model for that kind of engagement. And we were chatting beforehand about the Bible Project. That's another ministry that's been doing amazing work of getting biblical content out there. Tim Mackey and John Collins and I were classmates way back in 95 to 2000 in college, and so it's just been amazing to see what God has done through their ministry. And if you haven't heard of the Bible Project, just check it out afterwards. And you can check it out in the back of my books. I have QR codes to Bible Project videos that go with each chapter of the book, because I just really believe in their content. They're doing an amazing job, and I can't teach very well without Bible Project videos. I'm just always thinking like, well, there's a video I'd want to show to illustrate that. And so I got the permission of the publisher to include QR codes in the book so that you could learn along with me with my content. I think what I'd like to do is open in prayer and then we'll dive in. The plan is for me to talk tonight about Being God's Image, which is my new book. It's been out for about 6 weeks. And then tomorrow morning's service, I'm giving the message on bearing God's name. So as Matt said, we have both books here. They're $15. There's a couple of copies of Bearing God's Name in Spanish, if you or someone else would appreciate having it in Spanish. And then if we run out of anything, it's all on Amazon, so you can find what you need. But let's pray, and then we'll dive in. Father, we are so grateful that you have provided an air-conditioned room to hang out in the middle of this heat, and that you have provided the time and space for these men and women to come and join us this evening to talk about what it means to be human and what it means to be your image. Lord, for all those who are watching online, for all those who are here with us today, I pray a special sense of focus, and that whatever work needs to be done in each person's heart, that your Holy Spirit would do that work. There's no possible way that I could plan for what each person needs to hear, but Lord, you know where each one is at. So Holy Spirit, we just give you free rein to do your thing and to use this evening to help us become better disciples, receiving your grace, letting you tell us who we are and why we're here. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So my day job is I'm a professor of Old Testament at Biola University in Southern California. And so I hang out with students a lot. And I have the joy of kind of walking with them because they're at usually between 18 and 22 years old. And that's a very formative time of life where people are trying to figure out, who am I and where am I going to go in life? And I'm now old enough to know that that's not the only time in life where we wrestle with the who am I and where am I going to go in life. And I've already chatted with some of you who are in transitional spaces in your life where you're rediscerning what obedience to Jesus looks like in the next season. And I know from my childhood that there were times when God was speaking powerfully to me about who I am and what I'm here for. When I was in 5th grade, when I was in 7th grade, when I was in high school. And so I'm just thrilled that we have all of you here, because the big question that we want to wrestle with this evening is, who are we? Our world has lots of ways of answering that question, but typically in the United States, the answer to that question is you chart your own path, you create your own identity, you pick your avatar, you create your persona online, you kind of build your own brand, and you can be whoever you want to be. And what I've witnessed with college students is a tremendous amount of anxiety about this. It sounds great. It sounds great to make up your own identity, to become whoever you want to be, but it comes with a lot of pressure. A lot of pressure. That the pressure I see on students is, okay, how do I know what major I should choose? I'm investing a lot of money in tuition. What if I pick the wrong major? How do I know who I'm supposed to be and what I'm supposed to do when I'm done with school? And then they pick a major, and then they worry that they got it wrong, and they wonder if they're missing the will of God by picking the wrong path. So I see this kind of anxiety. And so part of what I like to share with them is the truth that we're going to talk about tonight about being the image of God, and the truth that we're going to talk about tomorrow morning about bearing God's name. Because if we truly understand who we are, the way the Bible describes it, not as a journey of self-determination, but a journey of receiving the givenness of who God says we are and what he says is true about us. If we can embrace that, it takes the pressure off. We have the agency, the joy of participating in the work of God in effect, God passes the baton and says, here, go for it. But so we have agency, we can do things, but it doesn't all depend on us to figure it out or to make it work or to find meaning. And so there's this nice balance in the middle that I try to help students find. The idea of writing a book on the image of God actually all started right here in Louisiana. Did I say it right? Louisiana. We say Louisiana where I live, but I'm told that's not quite right. Anyway, it all started, and I didn't realize this until I was making the PowerPoint. And I thought, I don't know if I've ever been to Louisiana before. And then I remembered, oh, but I have. I was at a conference in New Orleans in 2009. It was the Evangelical Theological Society meetings. So on Thursday, November 19th, there was a plenary address given by Dr. John Kilner from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. And I remember his PowerPoint still. This isn't true of all the messages I've ever heard, but I remember his PowerPoint because he had on the slides all of the ways that people have talked about the image of God. The image of God has been lost, it's been marred, it's been destroyed, it's been distorted, it's been diminished, it's been abdicated, it's been whatever. Like a whole slide full of ways that people have talked about the image of God. And then he gave us a whole slide of all the names of people who've said this. Really famous people throughout church history. People like, I don't know for sure which ones were on the list, but John Calvin and Augustine and John Wesley and big names through history who've said this. And then he had his own name up there because this is something that he's taught as well. And then he decided to study it more deeply, and he became convinced that it's actually not true, that the Bible does not say that the image of God was lost in Genesis chapter 3, or even that it was diminished in even a small way. And so John Kilner's an ethicist, and he explained to us what he felt the consequences were if we think the image can be lost. If the image of God is the basis for our treating other people with dignity, and we think that the image has been lost, then where is our basis for treating other people with dignity? So he was talking about how there's big ethical implications if we think that the image isn't there anymore. Do some people have the image and other people not? Are there gradations of the image? Anyway, he convinced me in that one session that the image of God has not been lost, that every human being is the image of God. So that was 2009. Fast forward to 2019, my book on bearing God's name had just come out. People were starting to ask me, so you say that the people of God bear his name, and that's like a representative role, like we represent God to the nations. That sounds kind of like the image of God. Is that kind of the same thing? Like we're the image of God, so we have this representative role. And I realized that we needed to have some conversations about how these two things are similar and how they're different. And the main difference is scope. Every human being is the image of God, full stop. Only the covenant people bear God's name. It's impossible for an unbeliever to take the Lord's name in vain because they are not carrying God's name to begin with. And I'll make the case for that tomorrow, for why I see it that way. But every human being is the image of God. And so I decided we needed another book. Partly because, as Matt said, there are some scholars out there who are taking really complex scholarly work and translating it for people who are non-specialists. You all are very smart in all of your own ways. But if you don't have a PhD in biblical studies, you're not going to be able to read someone's dissertation that they wrote on the image of God. It's going to have lots of technical language. It'll have Greek and Hebrew in it. It'll have maybe even German, French, Akkadian, Ugaritic. Like that's what a dissertation requires. And so it's in effect off limits to so many people. And I became convinced that the image of God is just like bearing God's name. Like we need to understand this. This is relevant to every single Christian. But not every single Christian can read the good work that's being published. And not every scholar has the sense of calling to take their technical work and translate it for a wider audience. So I decided to try to be that bridge, and I started reading dissertations on the image of God and deciding how to formulate it and how to say it with plain language. And so this book was born. So what I'm going to do tonight is give you kind of an overview of some of the big concepts that I believe the Bible teaches about the image of God, and they're all in the book as well. The book has stories, discussion questions, illustrations, lots of things to make it more engaging. And then, so tonight I'll weave some stories in as well, but they'll be different stories than what we have in the book. At the end of my presentation tonight, we're going to leave some time for questions. So as you're listening, if there's something you're wondering, jot down your question or put it in your phone or whatever, and there'll be time for you to ask whatever you want. No questions off limits. So if we want to talk about the image of God, we have to start with Genesis 1, because that's where the concept first comes up in the Bible. There's only 3 Old Testament passages that talk about the image of God. Genesis 1, Genesis 5, and Genesis 9. The rest of the Old Testament goes radio silent on the image of God. And then in the New Testament, it pops back up again, talking about Jesus being the image of God. So we'll talk about how that relates to what the Old Testament says in a minute. There have been lots and lots of books written, lots of sermons preached, lots of articles written about what does it mean to be the image of God through the centuries. Far more has been written than I could possibly have read. What I have read, though, has convinced me that we're barking up the wrong tree a lot of the time. That a lot of the conversations about the image of God have been on the wrong track because they've been approached philosophically rather than textually. They've been approached philosophically, and by that I mean somebody says, okay, how are humans different than animals? What does it mean to be human? Okay, then list all the differences. Okay, those things must be what it means to be the image of God. So image of God becomes the basket that we put all of this content into, metaphysical, philosophical truths about being human. Now, I believe, just so we're clear, that humans and animals are different. We have certain things in common, but we're way better, okay? Just so we're clear on that, we're different. But I don't think that if we brainstormed a list of differences, that would tell us what it means to be the image of God. I think we actually have to go back to the biblical text to see what is it saying about the image of God and what language is it using. And to understand that language, we need to know a little bit about the ancient Near Eastern context in which it was said. Because when you hear image, and when I hear image, maybe what comes to your mind is like what you see in a mirror. You look in a mirror and you see an image of yourself. And it's not three-dimensional. It's like it's a flat representation like you'd get on a Zoom screen or something, or in a photograph. That's an image, right? We use image to talk about that. Or we say we're thinking about our image, what we wear contributes to our public image. That's not what the word means in the Old Testament. That's when God says, let us make humankind as our image. It's not, let's make something that looks like God. And so what I'd like to do is try to unpack what this word would have meant in an ancient Israelite context, and then why that matters. We'll tease out some implications for current issues, events, problems in our world today. So here we go. Genesis 1:26 says, then God said, let us make humankind as our image, as our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created humankind as his own image. As the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. It would take a whole book to unpack that. Oh, I did unpack that all in my book. So let me just point to a couple of things about this. First, let's start with the word image. In Hebrew, the word is tselem, which is like, the word doesn't start with a T and it doesn't start with an S. It's like a TS sound. So think of the word it's, like it's hot outside. Everybody say it's. Now take the I off the front and just start with the ts. So tselem is the word for image. And you can all see now you can speak Hebrew. Tselem is a specific technical term in Hebrew that refers to a statue, a three-dimensional object. Usually, you'd find a tselem in a temple. So if you were going to the temple of Baal in a Canaanite city, or if you were going to the temple of Marduk in Babylon, you would walk in and there would be a statue of Baal or a statue of Marduk, and that's a tselem. And they understood that that tselem is not Baal or Marduk. That tselem represents Baal, or it represents Marduk. So interestingly, God makes the world. He makes the cosmos. He brings order to it. He provides space for flourishing, and then he populates the space with sun, moon, and stars, and with plants, and then with animals, fish and birds, and land animals, and then humans. But he doesn't just make humans. He says, let's make humans as our tselem. In other words, the world is a temple in which God is to be worshiped, but he doesn't want us to make a statue of him because he can't be represented well by a statue. You have to have someone who's three-dimensional, who not just three-dimensional, but alive, to truly represent God well. And so the moment you started growing in your mother's womb, the moment the cells started to multiply and you were a little baby, you were a tselem. You were a physical, three-dimensional representation of the presence of God on earth. And that's God's design, is for humans to represent him. So that every time someone sees a human, which we do typically throughout our day, we remember that God is the creator. Imagine with me, if we could all pile on a spaceship. I came on a plane here today, but imagine we got on a spaceship and we rocketed up and went to Mars. And we got out of our spaceship and somehow we could breathe. And we walked around and we suddenly, along with the pieces of meteorite and whatever you would find if you're on the lunar landscape of Mars, imagine if we came upon a gorgeous building with windows and doors and artistry, and it was just really well designed and well made. We would all realize in that moment, the moment we see that building, we would say, oh, someone is here. Right? This didn't just happen. This building points to the existence of a builder. It's telling us something about who's on Mars. And in a similar way, just by showing up, not by doing anything, when people see you, they know, there is a God. That's the message it's supposed to send. It sometimes gets scrambled. There is a God who intelligently designed these humans. This didn't just happen on accident. Someone made these people. So we can tell something about the Creator by looking at what he made. And so when God says, let's make humankind as our image, we reflect to the world something of the glory of God and of the presence of God. Okay, a couple more things. Maybe you noticed the underlined part, so that they may rule. So there's the image, which is just the fact that we're three-dimensional, we have human bodies, that makes us the image. But then there's the consequence or implication of being the image, which is we're going to rule. We have not just an identity, you are a tselem, but we have a purpose. You're a tselem so that you can rule. What do we rule over? And who's doing the ruling? What do you notice? There's a lot of things we're supposed to rule over, but there's one thing glaringly missing. What's missing? Human beings. Yes, Notice, it doesn't say, so that you may rule over each other, so that you may rule over children, so that you may rule over women. Humans, male and female, are the image of God. And what is an image supposed to do? Rule. Over each other? No. Together. We're supposed to rule together. Every human being is the image of God, which means every human being is supposed to be ruling. And nobody is supposed to be exploiting the labor of anyone else. No one is supposed to be exploiting, nobody's supposed to be using other humans to get what they want, to make themselves rich, to get a better car. By the way, if anyone saw the car that I drove up in today, I just want to say I ordered the economy. I ordered the economy, like I wanted the cheapest thing they had. And I went out there and I was like, this doesn't look like an economy car. So I'm driving a very nice car. It's embarrassing. It's also very nice. Lots of humans have ambitions. They want to climb the corporate ladder. They want to rule over it all. I'm thinking of, and I do use this illustration in the book, I'm thinking of The Lion King. When Simba is going around with his dad, and he's learning, like, what his future holds, and his dad says, everything the light touches is our kingdom. And Simba's like, you mean someday I'm going to rule all this? And his father has to rein in that instant ambition and say, it's yours to care for, not yours to exploit. You can't just use it to enrich yourself. The idea is to work together to maintain order. So many things just embedded in this very beginning statement about the image of God. Verse 28 goes on, God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground, but not each other. And I want to pause and talk about the word subdue, because that sounds kind of violent. It's the word kabosh in Hebrew, and that's about what it means. Kabosh. It's interesting because this implies that there might be problems, there could be intruders in the garden that have to be stopped. It implies from the beginning that to rule over the earth is not always just to smile and be nice, but sometimes we have to put our foot down and say, no, this is not okay here. So interestingly, we turn the page and we get to Genesis chapter 3, and there's an intruder in the garden. And Eve listens to the intruder. What is she supposed to do with the intruder? Kabosh. But she listens. Sometimes people are really hard on Eve for being such a strong leader. They say, see, all the problems that have come into this world because Eve took the initiative and she went out and took something for herself, and she should have just listened to her husband. Instead, she influences him. Okay, let's go back to Genesis 1. What did it say male and female are supposed to do? Rule and kabosh. I don't think the problem with Eve is that she was too ambitious or too aggressive. I think the problem is that she was not aggressive enough. She should not have listened to the serpent. She should have put a stop to the lies that he was spilling, which were designed to make her not trust God and not trust that what he said for them to do and not do would be good for them. She's like, oh, I want something good, and God's holding out on me, so I'm going to try this fruit. And by the way, her husband was with her. He just went along with it. And again, sometimes the lesson from that becomes, oh, men, you should just put your foot down and not listen to women, because look at what trouble it can get you into if you listen to women. If the woman in your life is trying to get you to disobey God, go ahead and try to put a stop to that. And vice versa. If the man in your life is trying to suggest that you can just disregard what God says, the goal in Genesis 2, when God makes man and woman, is for them to work together, side by side, to kabosh what doesn't belong in the garden, and to rule over creation. I didn't set out to write a book about gender roles, by the way. I just wanted to understand the image of God, and there's certain things that just came jumping off the page at me that seemed so clear when we go back to the beginning. And let me say this. For a very long time, the church has, not the whole church everywhere all the time, but many church communities have taken as their paradigm for gender relationships Genesis 3, where there's very clearly a hierarchy between men and women, and things are not harmonious. And we've made that the paradigm, instead of going back to Genesis 1 and saying, how did God make for this to work? What is God's intention? And God's intention, according to Genesis 1, is for male and female to rule over creation, side by side, for Eve to be a helper. Helper's not the right word. I'll have to teach you another Hebrew word. An azer, and everybody say azer. Azer kenegdo is what God says Adam needs. I would translate it, an ally corresponding to you. The word azer is always used in military contexts for somebody, either for God coming to your aid when you're under attack, or for an army to come as an ally and help you fight. What Adam needs is not a sidekick or someone to come clean up after him or make him sandwiches. What Adam needs is a fellow warrior who will kabosh when necessary. And the thing that goes off the rails in chapter 3 is that they don't do that. So, again, I didn't set out to write a book about gender, but there it is. Genesis 5, so I told you there's 3 passages that talk about the image of God. Genesis 1, 5, and 9. So we'll briefly look at 5 and 9 and consider what does this add to the picture of what it means to be the image of God. So far we have that it's something 3-dimensional, like our embodied humanness is what qualifies us to be the image of God. Genesis 5, for some people, suggests that the image gets lost. And so I want to show you why they say that and why I don't think that works. So in Genesis 5, this is, of course, after Adam and Eve's rebellion. And it says, this is the written account of Adam's family line. When God created humankind, he made them in the likeness of God. He created them male and female and blessed them, and he named them humankind when they were created. I forgot to talk about the word likeness. This statue here on the slide is a statue of Hadad Yithol. I think that's how you say his name. He was king of Guzan, somewhere in the ancient Near East. And he was a military kind of king, as most of them were. And he went and conquered a new territory. And he set up this statue of himself in that territory to remind everybody who's boss. So he's the new victor. He sets up a statue because he can't be everywhere at once. And he needs people to remember who rules this place. What's really cool, and the reason I'm showing you this, is because do you see how he has an apron? It's like sort of striped on top, but then it's kind of flat. You can't tell from here, but the flat part of his apron is inscribed with writing. And it's in, I can't remember if it's Akkadian or Ugaritic, but it's a cuneiform writing, like little wedge-shaped things that you would make with the end of a stylus. And it says that this is a tselem and a demuth. It uses the same two words for image and likeness that we have in Genesis for image and likeness. So this is how we know, this is one way we know that a tselem is a three-dimensional statue, because this one actually has a glossary on it. So this is part of a glossary for us. So to make them in the likeness of God, I take likeness to be basically a synonym of tselem and demuth. He created the male and female, blessed them. He named them humankind when they were created. When Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness, in his own image, and he named him Seth. And so some people say, look, Seth is not the image of God. He's just the image of Adam. It doesn't say that, but that's the inference that some people conclude. Like something clearly went really wrong in Genesis chapter 3. We can't expect that things are still just on track. So here, look, it's telling us Seth is only the image of Adam. So now he's like the imprint of the sinful nature that's being passed on instead of the image of God. Now that would maybe work if it weren't for Genesis 9. And I'll show you that in a moment. But what I get out of this passage is not that Seth isn't the image of God, but that we're learning a little bit more about what it means to be the image of God from this passage. So us being the image of God is kind of like Seth being the image of Adam. They're father, son. So being the image of God means God is our parent. Like we're family. We're part of God's royal family. He told us to rule, and he's king. So now we're part of God's royal family. So I think this is setting up an analogy for us so that we understand that relationship. But here's why I don't think we can conclude that the image was lost. Because in Genesis 9, after the flood, Noah gets off the ark with his family, and God gives him some new instructions. Up till now, they've been only eating vegetarian diet. And God says, now it's okay for you to eat meat, but you need to respect the life of the animal, drain the blood into the ground, not just like dig in and start eating raw bloody meat. So he wants them to show respect for the life of the animal. And he says that human life needs to be respected. And here's the little poem he gives to Noah, God gives to Noah to explain why. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. In other words, there's accountability being set up. If you murder someone, you will experience the death penalty because you need to know that this is not okay. And then the reason is given. The reason why you can't murder people. For as the image of God has God made humankind. Now, if the image was lost in chapter 3, then you couldn't say, don't murder anyone, because if you do, you're taking the image of God. You're destroying the image of God. If they're not the image of God anymore, then the reason against murder goes away. But this seems clear to me that the image of God is still intact and that it's the basis for ethical treatment of other people. Of course, it has more implications than just don't kill anyone. That's kind of like the obvious lowest bar. But what does it mean for how we talk to one another, how we treat one another in other venues? I think it has so much implication for that. If we truly believed that every human we encounter is the image of God, that they're part of God's royal family, that they've been given the task to rule creation, we might have to be more respectful to everyone we meet. We might have to honor them, even if we don't like them, even if they are a bully. People will often ask, so maybe one of you was already thinking of this question. Okay, Carmen, you say nobody loses the image of God, but really Adolf Hitler, you're saying he was still the image of God? Yes, I'm saying he was still the image of God. He is not living in alignment with that truth about himself when he's leading the Holocaust. Adolf Hitler, His problem was that he didn't understand the truth that every human being is the image of God. He actually made a whole different schema for deciding whether a person is worthy of having around. And his schema became more and more complex over time, so that it started with kind of obvious physical features. And then Nazi doctors would like measure your head and the distance between your eyes and the length of your nose. And he was all into these phenotypes to try to come up with the ideal race of human. And there isn't anybody in this room who thinks Adolf Hitler is a hero that we should emulate. But wow, that thinking that there's an ideal human that can be measured by height or weight or skin color or nose shape or distance of eye, that is actually so insidiously and deeply ingrained into our culture that certain people will be treated differently just by what they look like when they walk in a room, by what they're wearing, by what they're driving, by how they carry themselves, by their language. I'm trying to decide whether to tell you a story. When we lived in Charlotte, North Carolina for 6 years. I'm not from the South. I don't know if you've noticed that Southern accents in television, movies, etc., are not usually like the deeply respected person in the room is speaking in a Southern accent. It's more often something that's funny, right? So I'll never forget my first dentist appointment in Charlotte. And the dentist comes in, and he's got a thick Southern drawl. And I just like, you're a dentist? And you still talk like that? As if his language ought to have been educated out of him. Like the more you go on in school, the less you're going to talk like that. It's deeply ingrained in us, these assumptions about where people belong and who's worth what. So Hitler, we all agree, is bad. We're not like him. But wow, we need to interrogate the ways that we classify people as being worthy of our time and attention, or as having something to offer that we might need. Sometimes we think we're really godly because we're going to go help those people because they need us. And that's still an insidious form of racism or sexism or whatever it is, that we think we're going to condescend to help somebody. It's scary how often this is true in missions. We're going to go help those poor natives. And we don't recognize these are men and women made in the image of God. Therefore, they've been given the task to rule creation side by side with me. And what does that mean about the way I approach this community, or what I imagine is going to happen when I get there? If I walk in thinking I have all the answers, and you don't have anything that I need, that changes the dynamic. But if we go into every interaction imagining there might be something for me here, I might have something to learn here or to gain from you. One of the things that I talk about in the book is disability, and the ways that our culture is set up to center an able-bodied person. And then we think sometimes, okay, well, we're going to go out of our way and make space for someone with a disability to join us. So we're going to put a wheelchair ramp in, or we're going to make sure that somebody could navigate with a wheelchair into our sanctuary. But how often do you see a wheelchair ramp up to the platform? I don't see one up here. And so what does that say about what we expect from someone who's using a wheelchair? You're here so we can help you, or are you one of us? And can we learn from you? Disability is just one category. You can fill in all the rest. So here are some of the big takeaways. This is a review of what we've just been talking about. Every human being is the image of God. The Imago Dei, that's the fancy Latin way, fat and lancy. That's the fancy Latin way of saying image of God. The Imago Dei is not a capacity we possess, but a status. It's our identity. So being smart does not make you the image of God. And that might have sounded cheeky, but through most of Christian history, that's what people have thought, that our rationality is what makes us the image of God, which is a little bit problematic, because what about babies who are not very rational? Are they not yet the image of God? Or what about someone who experiences dementia? Are they not the image of God anymore? Or what about your friend or family member with Down syndrome? Are they not as much the image of God as you are because you have a degree, college degree? So I think it's very important that we detach our view of the image of God from capacity, whichever your favorite capacity is. It's a status and an identity that does not depend on your IQ, does not depend on how many friends you have, does not depend on your income bracket or anything. That status entails a responsibility to rule. We've already talked about how both male and female are God's image. And being God's image makes us family. It makes us part of God's royal family. But if we're all part of God's royal family, then all of you are my brothers and sisters. I had a very fun divine appointment on the plane to get here. The long flight from LA to Atlanta. I was reading a book about the Old Testament and working on a paper, Your Sons and Daughters Will Prophesy, paper that I'm going to present this fall at a conference. And the guy next to me was watching something on his phone, and I never even looked over and saw it. And all of a sudden, he caught my eye one time, and he was like, and I looked over at his phone, and he was watching. This young man and I do not look anything alike. He's African American. He had dreads. Or braids, beautiful braids. He's a fashion designer. He flies all over the world styling people, like famous people. He showed me magazine covers that he's worked on. He was watching a black woman preacher who was talking about women prophesying. And I was writing a paper about women prophesying. And he was like, and I was like, whoa. He goes, I was supposed to be in first class. And they stuck me back here. Something went wrong. And he said, I knew the moment I found out I had lost my seat in first class that there was a reason for it. So we spent the rest of the flight talking. And I feel like I found my lost brother. Not that he was lost, but that I hadn't seen him, right? I gave him my card. He's like, we're going to talk. We had such a great connection. I found a brother. And every person next to you on every flight is your brother or your sister. Because there's somebody made in God's image. Our identity as God's image cannot be lost or diminished. And then finally, I need to say something about Jesus, because you're all wondering. The Old Testament only has these 3 places where it talks about the image of God. When you get to the New Testament, all of a sudden, Paul is saying in his letters, Jesus is the image of God. And some people have concluded from that, and these are people I respect, so I don't want to be disrespectful in the way I say it, but I do disagree. Some people conclude from that Jesus is the image of God, and we're not anymore. Like, we lost it in Genesis 3, but now Jesus is the image of God. Or they assume, maybe on a more popular level, I don't hear scholars saying this, but I think a lot of people assume, Jesus is the image of God, because he's God. And we're in the image of God, which is sort of like one step removed. Actually, I would argue, and I say this in the book, that Jesus is the image of God, not because he's God, but because he's human. And every human being is the image of God. Now, is there a difference between Jesus and me? Yes. There is a difference. He's also God. I'm not. Jesus is also the image of God. He lives out his vocation that's implied by his status as the image of God in a much better way than I do, than we do. So Jesus the way I like to think about it is Jesus lives fully in alignment with his standing, his status as God's image. And the rest of us, half the time, are believing lies. We're operating according to a mental hierarchy about who's worth our time, or we're using people to get what we want instead of loving them well, instead of collaborating and ruling side by side. We do lots of things that are not what God meant us to do when he made us as his image. So we have messed things up. We haven't lost the image. We're just not living in alignment with it. Jesus is living in alignment with it fully, which is why he's glorious. Because when you can find a human who is living in alignment with their God-given identity and they're carrying out their God-given vocation, let me tell you, it is glorious. You've met people like this. You can see them glowing because they're just right there lined up with what they were born to do. Let me tell you a story and we'll come back to that slide. In 2019, just a few weeks after I met Matt at that conference, I was in San Diego for another conference. And then Biola University I didn't work at Biola yet, but they invited me to speak in chapel. I think we were courting, maybe. It was kind of an interview, unofficially. But anyway, they wanted me to speak in chapel, so so right after the conference, I took Amtrak from San Diego up to Los Angeles so that I could speak in chapel. So I'd been at this conference for 5 days, and I was hanging out with very smart people. Professors, program chairs, provosts, presidents. They were hanging out with me. They know my name. I know they had published new books. It was an academic conference. Everybody's sharing their new ideas. And these are wonderful people, and I love being with them. This is my highlight of the year academically, is to go to this conference. But I got it was just a few blocks away to go to the Amtrak station, and I got there and had 45 minutes to wait for my train to leave. And right when I got there, I looked across the room and made eye contact with somebody, and I smiled at him and he smiled at me, and then I went and sat down, and that's all I thought about it. That was the end of it. But he came over and sat beside me, and we struck up a conversation for 45 minutes because we had nothing else to do. And what a man. Of all the conversations I'd had at this academic conference all week, that's the one I remember. This man he had this sense of being so comfortable in his own skin that he wasn't posturing, he wasn't trying to prove his worth, which is what people do at academic conferences, right? They go around and try to sound smarter than the next person and try to justify their existence in the academy because they're, fallen humans. This man was just fully present, fully comfortable in his own skin. He just looked me in the eye. He was listening, asking me questions. We were talking about some trauma that I had experienced, and he very quickly figured out I was a Christian, and then all of a sudden scripture was in our conversation and what the life of faith, and this man was totally on mission. He totally knew who he was. Does it surprise you to hear that he also is someone experiencing homelessness? He had no place to live. He had no job. Everything he owned was in the black roller suitcase that he was carrying with him. And we had such a life-giving conversation. And the next day, I boarded a plane in Los Angeles to go back to Alberta, and I sat next to a man who had it all. This man was super wealthy. He owns tens of thousands of hectares of land in Alberta, which he farms. He owns property in San Francisco, and he doesn't just build things. He investigates to make it sustainable. He goes to the forest to see how they're cutting down the trees. He flies to Europe to find out how the equipment's being manufactured because he wants everything to be perfect. And he was in the process of losing his third marriage. His children wanted nothing to do with him. And he told me he was looking for himself. He was trying to find himself. He had flown to Nepal to meet with a guru to see if he could somehow find peace. Your paycheck is not a measure of how well you're living out your vocation as the image of God. It was so stark to me having these two conversations side by side. The man experiencing homelessness, the man who had it all. The contrast could not have been starker between the two of them. Both of them, the image of God. One of them knew it, and the other one did not. So we've already talked about implications. Implications for gender roles. I've spent plenty of time on that. Implications for race and ethnicity. I looked up the statistics of this community before I got here. I've never been to Monroe, so I just thought I'd check because I was curious. So what I read is that 60+% of residents of Monroe are black, and only 30% are white. And this is about what I was expecting tonight, and I wonder why. Why is the, okay, some of you came from all over. This is not like your congregation. But this is a question I ask when I walk into every church. Who's not here? And why? How have we decided to do life together in such a way that some people feel like they belong here and other people don't? And how can we rethink that? How can we build a bigger table? How can we... Here's what I think. I think we should not rest until the demographics on a Saturday morning or a Sunday morning match the demographics of the community we live in. So I'm not saying if you live in an all-white town and you have an all-white church that that's somehow sinful. But I am saying if your town is 60% black and your church is not, ask yourself why. Every human being is the image of God, and we have not learned how to live together as a human family in the ways that I think we need to. We learn so much from each other. I learned about Hebrew language this morning on that flight from my African American brother. He didn't know he was talking to an Old Testament professor. It was fun. Marriage and singleness is another area where I think we have work to do. Because I think in a lot of pockets of the church, we have acted as if or talked about marriage as if singleness is a temporary state on your way to marriage. And if you want to be a full-fledged human, you're married with children. So married with no children is a bit suspect. Not married at all, or used to be married, is also a bit suspect. I'm not saying that's true at this church. I don't know how y'all do it. I just know when I lived in the South and I listened to Christian radio every day, it was family-friendly radio, and it was always all about family, and what they meant by that was nuclear family, because they talked about the moms driving a minivan with the kids in the car whose ears you wouldn't have to worry about what your kids were going to hear on this radio station as you were driving around, because it would be appropriate. And I was always thinking, what about the adults? Don't we also want to hear uplifting and God-honoring messages? And what about if you're alone in your car and you're a single adult? That means any station is fine? Like, I don't know. Yeah, it's good for families when there's good radio, but I just think that we haven't learned to actually treat every human being as a full-fledged image of God, even if they're not married. My mom my parents are both experiencing singleness again because they've just been through a divorce, and it's been interesting to hear what it's like to navigate life single. It's not easy. And I think the church has work to do in that area, especially if we are conservative on the issue of sexuality and we're trying to uphold a traditional view of sexuality and marriage between one man and one woman. We can't say, on the one hand, if you're same-sex attracted, then you need to be celibate and not get married, and then have churches that don't know what to do with singles. Do you see how this is not going to work? Like, if we're going to uphold the traditional biblical view on marriage, then we also have to think radically about how can this congregation be the body of Christ and become a family. And I heard a story not long ago about a young woman who was same-sex attracted and who had become convinced that the Bible teaches her that she should not marry. And she went to her church and she said, okay, so you do a blessing for marriage. Can you do a blessing for me as a celibate single woman? And they were like, why? What do you want from us? And her response was, I want you to be the family that you're saying I can never have. And the pastor's response was, yeah, people don't really have time for that. If we're going to be serious about discipleship, and if we're going to be serious about biblical sexual ethics, then we have to rethink how we do life, not even just how we do church, but how we do life together and how we become God's family. Work there's all kinds of implications for work, for our work. And I'll just summarize it this way. Your work matters because you're the image of God and God's given you work to do. He gives Adam and Eve work right from the get-go. We're made to work. Our work matters, but it does not make us matter. Some of us work really hard trying to become worthy. We do a lot of work because we're trying to be worthy or we're trying to be lovable. And the Bible's teaching on the Imago Dei has convinced me that our work matters, but there isn't anything you can do or not do to increase or decrease your value in the eyes of God. So we need to just properly resituate our work. We have the joy of working. We don't work to make ourselves worthy. I've already mentioned disability. I'll just close with our future destiny. For most of my life, and I'll be 46 here in a couple weeks, so that's however long, you can sort of picture the decades that I've lived through. For most of my life, the way I've heard the gospel preached is that you're a sinner, but Jesus died for your sins, and if you ask him in your heart, then you can go to heaven when you die. Like, beam me up, Scotty. I'm not going to be here anymore. I'm going to get out of here. In fact, I'm going to get rid of this body and go be disembodied somewhere. I think my study of the image of God has convinced me that creation, we haven't taken creation seriously enough. If it's true, if I'm right, that being the image of God means to have a human body. Our human embodiment, our three-dimensionality is part of what it means to be the image of God. And if Jesus came in a body and was raised in a body and ascended in a body, that says something about where this is all going. And it's far more physical than I was led to believe when I was growing up. And so that's why the subtitle of the book is Why Creation Still Matters. Because it's not just temporary, like, okay, God's like, okay, I'm going to try this for a little while. Okay, that did not work. Let's get you out of here. Let's break open these bodies and let your soul go free, and you can just be free. That's not what the scriptures teach about our destiny. I think we need to tell a better story. I think when we share the gospel, we should start with chapter 1 of Genesis, not chapter 3. You are the image of God, created with dignity and purpose. You are not living in alignment with that purpose. you have sinned and fallen short. I'm not saying to take sin out of it. You can still do Genesis 3. But start with the beginning. And this is all headed to new creation, where because of the life, death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus, God is making all things new. And now if anyone is in Christ, new creation. Jesus, as he's raised from the dead, is not just like, whoa, that was a cool trick. But he's the first fruits of all who fall asleep, which means all of us are physically gonna come up out of the ground, which is a little creepy if you think about it. I used to take my daughter driving in a cemetery to practice because everybody's already dead there and you don't have to worry about killing anybody. And so we would just like drive around the cemetery, and one day we were talking about, I said something like, isn't it gonna be weird on Resurrection Day when all these bodies like come up out of the ground? Like, I wonder what that'll look like. And she like slams on the brakes. What? What are you talking about, Mom? No, we are going to come up out of the ground. Our bodies will be raised to new life. I don't know how that's all going to work. If you've already decomposed, I trust that God will regather your DNA somehow. I'm glad I'm not in that. That's not my job. But we have a glorious future to look forward to on this earth, which God will renew and restore and make it everything that he meant for it to be and more because of our participation. So that is our glorious destiny. I've been talking for just over an hour. We have about 25 minutes for questions. I would love to know what you want me to talk about more, or where you're maybe feeling not quite convinced and you want me to run through something again. Is it on?
Testing. Oh. All right, so I do have a question about going back to creation, right? God created man and woman and told them to multiply. Mm-hmm. And so I agree with what you've said. And so the burning question, especially because we have teenagers and they haven't found a spouse yet, is always, what about in heaven? Are we going to be married? And so I always personally take it back to creation. If God created man and woman to be together and God walked with them in the garden, why would that not be what we go back? I just wanted to get your opinion on that.
Yeah, so we don't have a lot of data on that other than Jesus saying in heaven there will be neither marriage nor giving in marriage, but you'll all be like the angels. Which totally clears everything up because we know all about angels. I'm not sure. Whatever it will be good. I've heard people speculate in different directions, but I don't have a way of adjudicating between those. I would say it's worth mentioning that I don't think that multiplying is essential to our human identity. That is, to have babies doesn't make us the image of God, because Jesus, to state the obvious, was single, unless you believe the Da Vinci Code. Jesus was single, and he was the exact representation of God. So we have the capacity to multiply, and there's a blessing and an encouragement to multiply, but our humanness does not depend on that, which is why if you have a single adult or childless couple, they're still every bit the image of God. Good question.
Anybody else?
I was just wondering if you could expand a little bit on the part where it says it is yours to care for. It's kind of a broad question,
Yeah.
but I didn't really have a lot on that when it says just it's yours to care for. Do you have any
Yes.
more on that?
Yeah, there's a definitely an open-endedness to what God tells humans they're going to do so that you may rule. Okay, like, what does that look like? Waste management? Yeah, that's part of it. Gardening? Yeah, that's part of it. One of the things we are told, which is interesting because we have so little information here to work with, it becomes foundational for everything else. So it's not that we learn everything we ever need to know about being human from Genesis 1 and 2, but there's a lot here we can start with. And I find it interesting how things play out in chapter 1, verses 29 and 30. So this is just after the part we read together. Then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. This resolves, by the way, the problem of the earth being formless and empty at the beginning. It's formless, there's water everywhere, which means you can't live there. And it's empty, which means there's nothing to eat. So for a farmer, this would be like a big problem. And so the problem of formlessness and emptiness gets resolved over the course of chapter 1. And it's all brought into order. Light and dark are separated, sky and water are separated, and then dry land and sea are separated. So you've got 3 places made or domains, and then each one's populated. So it's beautiful symmetry. Okay. So great news, they will be yours for food, and to all the beasts of the earth and all the birds in the sky and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. What does that mean? It means the food God just gave us, he's also giving to the animals, which means it's not all mine. I have to share. And so part of creation care is our human responsibility to help make sure species don't go extinct, to make sure that animals can migrate and have space to do so. That obviously wasn't a problem in Adam and Eve's day. Things could migrate wherever they needed to. But with the way our world is now, migration patterns have been disrupted by human civilizations. And I grew up in a conservative Christian context in which people who tried to save the spotted owls were laughed at for being environmental extremists. And I'm not saying that we should prioritize owls over humans, but I do think that we need to recover what the scriptures say about it's our job to share and to figure out how to share, which means we need to farm in such a way, we need to do industry in such a way, we need to raise animals in such a way that they have access to what they need for flourishing. When we do that, we're acting like God, who is the model farmer who creates this seed-bearing utopia garden for us to flourish in. And so we should do that too. So there are lots of ways that we could think about living this out in whatever industry or career that you work in, or in your home. There are ways that you can take steps. Like, I personally can't save the planet and make everything work right, but I can think about more sustainable use of resources for our household. I can think about picking up trash as I walk to work and back every day, so that, because where I live, the trash goes straight to the ocean. There's like a little creek through our neighborhood. If the trash blows into the creek, that's going straight out to the Pacific. So like, I'm saving Nemo every day when I pick up granola bar wrappers or whatever. So that's one thing we can do. It's not the sum total of what humans are supposed to do, and it's not the only thing we should or can care about. But one thing that I've learned and realized more fully, growing up, people were like, no, we should work on saving souls. We shouldn't worry about the environment or get all caught up in the environment when we could spend our time sharing the gospel and saving souls. That's a very disembodied way of thinking about our future. That it's the beam me up Scotty approach to eschatology rather than recognizing the new creation that's coming. But B, it fails to recognize that as we care for the earth, we actually are caring for people too. because we export our most messy projects to communities that then, where the property values plummet, and so we end up with lower class neighborhoods, lower income neighborhoods, right next to the strip mining project or the, fill in the blank, mountaintop removal that's poisoning water sources. And the communities that are most affected by bad management, bad stewardship, are communities that don't always have a voice or don't always know how to navigate the system to be heard. And they're not taken seriously because they don't have the big bucks to lobby for different practices. So if you're interested in exploring this more, one of the resources I point to in the book is Sandra Richter's book, Stewards of Eden, where she talks like really deeply about creation care in each chapter. I mean, really deep readings of scripture. She's brilliant. But then also pairs each chapter with a current issue like mountaintop removal or like the mass farming, what's the word for it? Like all the chickens that never see the light of day and the way we raise cattle and all of that. She talks about humane treatment of animals in conjunction with what do the laws of Deuteronomy say about humane treatment of animals? Like how does God setting up the Israelite society to care about these things? There's way more stuff about creation care in this Bible than I'd ever realized until I read her book.
How would you unpack the Ezra Connecto with, say, the Bill Gothard model?
Okay, so I'm not an expert in the Bill Gothard model, but I have seen the diagram, the umbrella and the umbrella and the umbrella, and I'd like to know who actually does that in the rain. If you have a big umbrella, you don't need an umbrella under the umbrella unless the big umbrella has a hole in it. So if God is my covering, then I don't need another covering under that and another covering under that and another covering under that. Yeah. We could probably leave it at that. I mean, it's clear from what I shared earlier how I feel about hierarchies between humans. This is not to say that there's never any leadership where somebody takes the lead. That happens all the time. My previous institution that I worked at was Prairie College up in Canada, and I really loved the model of leadership there. The president would talk, Mark Maxwell would talk about someone's time to step up and lead, and other people's time to follow that lead. But it was very organic. So we had a board member who lived in the town, who was a full-time volunteer at the school and helped with programs. So he was a board member, which meant he was my boss, but then he helped out with the program that I led, which means I was his boss as he volunteered. And he worked on special projects in which my husband worked for him, because my husband also worked at Prairie, and our kids went to school together, so we were also friends. And the ability to move seamlessly from one mode to another, where like in this arena, you're leading, and in this one, I'm leading. And the ability to do that, I think, is a good measure of institutional health, because we can't all take the lead on everything, and we all have different sets of gifts and things to offer. So if we can begin to defer to each other in areas where each other is stronger, that's beautiful. Yeah, no umbrellas necessary.
I had to smile a little bit when you were talking about the ramp on stage. The church that we share with, their pastor is in a wheelchair.
Whoa.
He preaches down on the bottom, though.
He must.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
On your question, or your comment about you looked at the demographics of our area, and I agree with you in several things that you said about as Christians, sometimes we separate our devotion to God and our business, or how we handle our business, whether we treat people or cheat people, or we treat them kindly. What is a recommendation you have for churches to be more diverse in to be more like the exact demographics of your area.
Yeah.
What is your recommendation of achieving
Okay.
that?
First thing I want to say is that if you're in a church that's mostly white, it is not the fault of all the black people in your community or all the Latino people or whatever that they're not coming. Like, this is not to place blame on the people who are not here for not coming. Okay, so just to be clear about that. The other thing I want to say is, I mentioned earlier we need to build a bigger table where people feel like they belong. Has it ever crossed our minds that we should go be the visitor in a black church? Or that we should go join another project? It doesn't always have to start with me. It doesn't always have to be my project. And I think our ability to follow someone else's leadership when that someone does not look like us or does not have the same background as we have, that's a test of our Christian discipleship and our humility. If we can come under someone else's leadership, if we can join someone else's project, and it's not always all about inviting people to my project and having you come to my house and do things my way. So we attended a church in Charlotte that was very ethnically diverse, the most diverse community we've ever been part of, and it was a joy. One thing that they did that I noticed, that you just notice right off the bat, is when you walked into the foyer, the whole wall had Jesus is Lord in different languages, all these different languages. So you walked in and you recognize, like, oh, we expect all these languages are going to be present here. And so that was one thing. We had a thriving English as a second language ministry going on at the church that helped people get in the door, and we were helping them with practical skills of language learning so that they felt they had a home there and could be involved. But I think it's super important to then have diversity in leadership. Not because this is some kind of like quota system and we have to like match whatever the government is requiring, but because we actually believe deep down in our hearts that every person is the image of God, and we recognize that a different life experience actually qualifies us to see things that others might miss. And we have something to offer that others don't have. And so if we truly believe that God creates a panoply of cultures and that this is a good thing, then we would want to have as many represented as possible, because otherwise we're missing out on what we could learn from each other. So I think one of the things that has made things work for this church in Charlotte is they have staff members of multiple ethnicities. It's a large church, so they have lots of different staff. And another place where I've seen this go well is our church that we were part of in Oregon. Small Mennonite church out in the country. And the white church, which is the one my husband's grandfather used to pastor, so it's, been part of our family story for generations, is slowly aging and dying. But there was a Latino church meeting in the same building and having their services in Spanish, and they were growing like gangbusters. So one thing that happened is they began starting to have their Sunday schools combined. So the kids were having Sunday school together. So the kids were growing up together, and they were friends, like genuinely integrated. And the more they grew, the more the parents then got to know each other. And the more the Latino congregation outgrew the little side room that they were meeting in and needed more space, so they came into the sanctuary and started using the sanctuary on Sunday afternoons. And then they decided, why are we two congregations? We should just be one congregation. So now they are. They've covenanted together. They joined as one congregation, and there are still two pastors, one English speaking and one Spanish speaking, and they take turns preaching. And so on any given Sunday, you might find my grandmother listening to the sermon translated into English for her, or you might find someone from Mexico hearing the other pastor's sermon being translated into Spanish. and the worship team is blended, and the songs are blended, so verse in English and a verse in Spanish. It's beautiful. I just think it's so beautiful. There's nothing flashy about it. It's, again, a little country Mennonite church. But they're learning to do life together. And they're learning that you have something that I need, and I have something that you need, and there's a beautiful collaboration to it. So about 7 years ago, it's been more than that now, 8 or 9 years ago, I had finished my PhD. And I looked back on everything I'd been asked to read over the course of my biblical education. I had 4 years of Bible college, 5 years in seminary, 5 years working on a PhD. I can count on one hand the number of books by a person of color that I was asked to read. I can count on one hand the number of books by a woman that I was asked to read. And I didn't have a single professor of Bible or theology who was a woman in all my education. Now again, I'm not advocating the quota system, but I am saying I realized I missed out. Because there are perspectives to be gained when we listen to people who are not like us and who've experienced the world in a different way. And so I made it my mission to start to diversify what I read and who I learn from. And so on the plane today, I was reading a book by Wilda Gaffney, who's an African-American biblical scholar. The woman is brilliant, so insightful. She's finding all these places in Scripture where women are participating that I didn't even notice. Doing very careful work. And so I have a growing, my favorite shelf in my personal library is the books that I'm reading up from global scholars, from people of color. They're teaching me so much. So we can read broadly. So it's not always about like hiring someone or doing the way we do the services. It's who are you listening to? What podcasts are you listening to? What books are you reading? If you want a place to start, those of you who are pasty white like I am, the Jude 3 Project is doing some amazing work. Lisa Fields is a black apologist, and she has amazing guests on, and just really good work on presenting the gospel to this generation. So that's one place. The AND campaign is another group that's doing really good work that's crossing the aisle politically, crossing race, gender, and being more collaborative in a very thoroughly Christian way. So listen to more voices and find out what you've been missing. It's been a good journey for me.
So this is a little different question.
Yeah.
Genesis 2:17, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you must not eat, for in the day that you eat of it, you will surely die. So that last little pericope, for in the day that you eat of it, you will surely die. And I know that this has a lot of eschatological significance as you kind of roll forward. So what do you take of that last phrase, for in the day that you eat of it, you will surely die, knowing that Adam and Eve, of course, it depends on how you want to nuance the story. So you understand where I'm going with that.
Yeah. I'm not 100% sure where I land on this, but I think here's what I lean towards, and I'm open to learning more if somebody wants to fill in some more for me. In the day you eat from it, you're making a choice to go after wisdom outside of God's will. You're trying to seek wisdom outside of God. He says he makes the world, he calls it good. And I think he wants them to grow in the knowledge of good and evil. But I think Adam and Eve are supposed to come to him to know what is good and what is not good. And this tree represents the getting that outside of God. And he says, in the day when you eat of it, your doom is assured. I will not be able to allow you to live forever in that state of having made that wrong choice and seeking goodness outside of me. That's a path that leads to death. So I would take it, in the day you eat of it, you're now on the path at the end of which you certainly die.
Is the Hebrew there in dying, you will die?
Dying, you will die.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So the process of dying begins that moment, and it will culminate at some point when your breath leaves you. That'd be one way to take it. Yeah, yeah.
I was trying to think of I forgot who it was. I just recently looked at this and even had a good discussion on social media about it. But I was trying to remember which scholar I was reading that does wrote a great paper on this very question. I think a lot of it has to do with in the phrase "dying, you will die," but it's used elsewhere as a sentence that's not intended for that day. And I was trying to think of the actual passage.
Touching the mountain at Sinai.
Touching the mountain at Sinai.
In the day if you touch it, you will surely die.
Yeah.
One
Oh,
place.
that's a good one. There was one. I'm gonna really bad that Old Testament students fits to not remember the passage, but
That's not really
the
bad.
king.
There are lots of passages, Matt. We can't know all of them.
There was the story where the king told, who'd he tell, not to leave his house or cross the river.
Oh yeah.
Who was that?
Absalom.
Absalom.
Yeah.
And yet he does, and he goes all the way, like spends multiple days clearly from the text,
Yeah.
and comes back. But the sentence was, "The day you cross the river, you will surely die." It's almost identical.
Okay. Yeah, there will be a
2:17.
bounty on your head.
Yeah,
the
that's
moment
it.
you cross that river, you're a wanted man.
You're a dead man, is how I kind of
You're a
put
dead
it. Yeah.
man.
In our modern
Eventually.
vernacular.
Yeah.
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 On the idea of subdue, and kibosh is something I didn't know. A Tim Mackey aha moment for me, among dozens of them, was when I realized that the garden wasn't the whole earth, that it was inside of Eden, and Eden was inside of
Yeah.
the rest of the world. And my take on it had always been that to subdue meant that Adam and Eve and their progeny, when they multiply, were to spread the garden out to cover
Yes.
the rest of the world. Is that
I take it that way as well.
okay?
I don't think that's all that's meant by kibosh, but I do think the subduing the earth is that Adam and Eve are intended to expand the boundaries of the garden, to keep cultivating more land, which is why they have to be fruitful and multiply, because they can't do it all themselves. But as there are more and more humans, they can expand until the garden encompasses the whole earth. So the really cool thing, and we'll close with this because we're out of time, is in the vision of the New Jerusalem in Revelation 21 and 22. John sees the New Jerusalem coming down out of heaven from God. And it's this beautiful combination of the city with a garden inside. So it's the Garden of Eden, but it's in a city, and there's 12 gates, and the gates are representing the 12 tribes. And it says that the city is as wide as it is high and as it is long. So it's cubic, which doesn't really work, right? How do you build a cubic city? But the cubic city is the other thing in the Bible that's cubic is the Holy of Holies. And so what that seems to be indicating in John's vision is that the Holy of Holies, which was the hot spot of God's presence, to put it in Tim Mackey's phrase, is now coterminous with the entire cosmos. Like now sacred space is everywhere. And it fulfills what Zechariah says at the end of his prophecy, that in that day, even the bells on the horses will say, "Holy to Yahweh." Like everything will be holy. Everything will belong fully and completely to God. So that nobody asked me about this. What about the fire in 2 Peter that's going to burn up the earth? I take that fire to be the purifying fire, not the destroying fire. But like if you put gold jewelry in the fire, it's burning away the dross, but the gold remains. So the fire in Peter I take as a purifying fire that's going to get rid of all the crap in this world that doesn't belong here, that's not part of what God intended for his good world. So let's build things that are good. Let's do things that are good, because my clear sense from Scripture is that these things will last into the eschaton. It's not like all of this is going up in smoke. Some of what we do will last. And that's the joy of participation. We do work now that matters. It matters not just now, but for eternity. It doesn't make us matter, but it matters. Let me pray for you, and then if you have other questions, I'll hang around and chat with you as long as you like. It's very likely that I have said something this evening that rubbed you the wrong way. It's very likely, because we've covered a lot of ground, controversial topics. And so I just want to let you know that we can still be friends, even if you don't agree with everything that I've said. And you can still learn from the book, even if you don't line up in every place. I talk about a lot of things in the book because I think the image of God matters for all these different areas, not because I have the corner on the market and I've gotten all of it figured out and it's the final word. What I'm hoping to do is start a conversation. So if you need to disagree with me in places and take it in a little bit different direction, that I am okay with that. So let me pray for you. Lord, thank you for this time that we've had to dig into a topic that matters. And Lord, I don't know what was stirring in the hearts of those who are here, what bothered them, what challenged them, what ministered to them, maybe brought healing to some corner of their heart. I pray that you would take what I've said tonight and do with it what you say you're going to do with this world. That is, purify it, burn up all the stuff that didn't belong, that was coming from me and not from you. Let those things just be let go of and forgotten. And let us walk away clinging to the truth of what the scriptures say about who we are and why we're here. Help us to collaborate together in creative ways. Help us to love one another fully. Help us to recognize that we can never truly know ourselves outside of knowing you. And that you're calling us and every other human on this planet into relationship with yourself and into this collaborative human project. Help us to see the joy in that. And help us to rightly order our lives so that we don't believe lies about ourselves or others, or don't work for things that are worthless. Help us to do work that matters. Thank you for the privilege of being your children and part of your human family. We dedicate all of this to you with gratitude. In Jesus' name, amen.